Okay, so a very warm welcome to everybody here, to everybody online. There are lots of people joining us online, and a very special warm welcome to Jean, who is Julian's husband. The Julian Priestley Memorial Lecture is an annual event which was established to honour Sir Julian Priestley, who many of us will have known as a highly influential British civil servant who served as Secretary General of the European Parliament from 1997 to 2007. Following his death in 2017, some of his very good friends created this lecture series as a tribute to Julian and all the work that he did. And European cooperation and to public service. He was European to his bones, and he never wavered, from leading the student campaign for EU membership to becoming Secretary General of the European Parliament. And his tenure coincided with that of the Labour government and Britain's embrace of the European Union. They were challenging times, but in retrospect, they were halcyon days for the European Union, and especially for those of us on the left. It was a time when democracy, freedom, prosperity, and peace, they were the watchwords. But it was also a time when the Front National, Fidesz, and UKIP were spreading their bile and fanning the flames of populism, which then gave succor to others to establish parties like the AfD. I could say much more, but I won't, because we want to listen to Jonathan. Like Julian, Jonathan studied PPE at Oxford, but he was a Wadham man, not a Balliol man. He has been a leading voice in British journalism and public debate. He is, I would say, fearless. He is bold. He's prolific, and perhaps best known for his long-standing weekly column in The Guardian and for presenting BBC Radio 4's contemporary history series, The Long View. But many of you will also listen to his podcast, Politics Weekly America. You might have seen his play and read thrillers under his pseudonym, Sam Bourne. And I recently heard him give a lecture next door at the Blavatnik. It was the Alfred Landecker lecture, and it was centered on his non-fiction book, The Escape Artist, the story of Rudolf Weber, one of the few Jewish prisoners ever to break out of Auschwitz, and his attempt to alert the world to the horrors there. It was brilliant, and so is the book, and I thoroughly recommend it. Jonathan's views on Europe are admirably clear. In November, he wrote, "Brexit makes no sense in a world dominated by Trump. Britain's place is back in the EU." I would suggest that the first 100 days of Trump's presidency, when he's created instability and chaos throughout the world, that view is gathering even more support. This evening's lecture, Trump Changes Everything, how the US president makes a new UK approach to Europe essential, could not be more timely. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jan, for that very kind introduction. I'm very, very glad to be here. Like every good European, tonight I am thinking about Paris and I am dreaming of Munich. And some of you will think that is a very elliptical reference to the Franco-German news conference earlier today, that perhaps I'm making some point about the pragmatism of Emmanuel Macron and a subtle argument about the potential idealism of Germany under new leadership. I'm afraid it's nothing so subtle. Tonight is the Champions League semi-final between my team Arsenal and Paris Saint-Germain. The game tonight is in Paris, but if we win, we will be in Munich. So I'm thinking about Paris and dreaming of Munich. I mention that partly because my hosts here are very forgiving, even though they are several of them Liverpool fans who could have really enjoyed my pain at being separated from this match. Instead, they are accommodating me in a very nice way. So if I'm not around later on, as long as I would have liked to have been, you will know why, because I am seeking to cheer on a cause that some people think is doomed, because Arsenal go into this game 1-0 behind. but which, like everyone in this room, we don't believe in lost causes, and we believe instead that any situation can be turned around. So that's how I go into tonight. It is a great honor to give a talk in the name of Julian Priestley, as we heard just then, a devoted servant of the European project, and I think very relevantly for what I'm going to talk about, a servant of the European democratic project. His career was, and I don't think it's a coincidence, devoted to the Parliament, the democratic, in the most democratic institution. And one of the last pieces he wrote, again, just to emphasize, I think in some ways his prescience, but also the timeliness, he warned then of the cold climate of populism and authoritarianism. And in a way that is, the context, the backdrop for some of the points I want to make tonight. So as you heard, this title we've chosen, Trump is Changing Everything. Trump is changing everything, everywhere, all at once, to invoke that film. I mean, just to break that down into three constituent parts, the all at once point is not immaterial. The sheer speed by which this is happening, it's only just over 100 days since this started, and so much has happened. And I don't think that's an accident. I think there is, I mean, you speak to Republicans and they say this is shock and awe, meaning they have learned from the technique from the Iraq War, which is that you stun your opponent, you leave your opponent reeling if there is an overwhelming display of power and force and speed. And so that is partly deliberate, and I think it partly explains the sort of stunned opposition you see on the battlefield in the United States, Democrats reeling, only just now, a few of them beginning to marshal some kind of resources. But I think you see it too in the stunned reaction of many, not all, we'll come on to those who have read the moment very well, but a sort of stunned reaction from world leaders who have not known quite what to make of this, because nothing like it has really happened before in terms of its speed, where everything changes so quickly. So that's the all at once bit. The everything bit, I mean, a non-exhaustive list would start at the 100 or so executive orders he has issued, normally a fairly limited governmental tool, these signed declarations. He has been issuing them at a daily rate. We will come on to talk about, obviously, tariffs. We will talk about Ukraine, but the deportations of undocumented migrants to a gulag in El Salvador, the hiring of Elon Musk, a private and commercially interested, in the sense of biased, citizen, to take an axe to the federal government, to many of its agencies, entirely abolishing USAID, the Agency for International Development. In effect, it's gone. Abolishing, or in transit, the Department of Education, a program which is gutting science in America and the National Institutes of Health, so that each day you read of new groundbreaking research that has just been halted. The latest thing I read, literally in the last half hour, is a program that was developing a tiny little pump that would go into the hearts of newborns who had faulty hearts. The program was succeeding. It was ready to go. The money has been cut off today for that. I mean, it defies reason, much of it. And that is a non-exhaustive list. I mean, that's just a small sense. And then that brings us, having said all at once and everything, it brings us to everywhere. Obviously, the first place to feel the impact of all this is the United States itself. It can be hard to get a sort of big picture view of it, but I would pick out just one as one example. The rule of law. I think it is now an open question whether the United States is governed by the rule of law. You see it in the form of intimidating of judges, the kind of thing that we would have reported on in what we might have politely called emerging democracies or backsliding democracies, countries that are no longer democratic, when judges are intimidated. Just a small instance, I don't think it's got anything like the attention it deserves. Judges who have ruled against Donald Trump have found themselves in receipt at their homes, crucially, of an unordered pizza arriving at the door. And you think, well, that's odd. The unordered pizza that arrives at your home is a technique used in particularly sort of organized crime circles as a way of saying, we know where you live. Several judges, I think the figure is 11, I would want to check that because it may be higher since I wrote about this, have received these pizzas arriving on their door after they'd ruled in some way against Donald Trump. A small thing, but a telling thing. Intimidating judges is, as it were, trumped by ignoring of judges. This is far more serious. Judges have given rulings that are crystal clear and operable and actionable. The most famous one is this particular case of a migrant who was wrongly, all of them in a way wrongly, but this person there was a mistaken identity issue, and he was put on a plane, and a judge in Washington, D.C. ruled immediately that he should be returned and the plane should turn around, which can happen for deportation flights. And the government defied it, just ignored it. That is a really new development for a judge's ruling to go unenforced. And when challenged about it, the Attorney General says of judges, I'm quoting, that these are leftist, lunatic, deranged judges. And most recently, I think you will have seen this judge in, I think, Wisconsin, who was arrested in her own chambers for having defied the authorities. I mention all this because I think there is a real issue, which, as we'll come to see, travels beyond the United States when the United States is governed in this way. I don't think the defiance of courts is, as it were, a sort of accident. And I refer you all, it's worth looking back at comments J.D. Vance made in February of 2024. So before he was on the ticket as a nominee, vice presidential nominee, making the argument that how would a Supreme Court who challenged executive power enforce its ruling if the executive chose not to comply with the ruling? How would it do it, he asked. They have marshals, this very small enforcement agency, which answers to and are employees of the Department of Justice, which is itself answerable to the president. And so J.D. Vance threw this out there as if to say, well, you and whose army? If the Supreme Court itself rules against the executive, who's going to stop them? And you've seen Donald Trump recently quoting, saying, he who breaks the law to serve his country commits no crime. He posted that on social media. A lot of people thought that's an oddly heightened register. It doesn't sound like Donald Trump, pseudo-poetic language. The author of that quotation was Anders Breivik. That's a quote from Breivik's manifesto that Trump put out. So this is many people, me included, were accused of Trump derangement syndrome last year, that we were getting overly hot under the collar and we were exaggerating. I don't hear that so often anymore, by the way. That charge doesn't come. I think, if anything, the risk is Trump minimization syndrome, where we almost downplay how serious a threat this is. And that's why I give you some of these examples. That's the rule of law one, I think, is just illustrative, emblematic of the nature of the project. That's before you even get to the ripping up of the federal government. He's coming, I think, it seems obvious to me, to the minimal safety net that exists in the United States, Medicaid and so on, in order to fund a $4.5 trillion tax cut that will massively, disproportionately benefit the 1%. And I don't know if many of you saw this graph just now, statistically, for the first time in ever. And these figures go back more or less a century. The 1% in the United States now own more wealth than all of the middle class, which is, as you know, in the United States, incredibly broadly defined put together. And so this would accelerate that trend. Obviously, there's lots of individual things. I think the overall theme of what's going on domestically, and I'm spending time on the domestic agenda because it has resonance and meaning for the international picture, which is obviously where I'm heading. But the main theme of all this is a power grab. It's about power. If you're trying to connect the different actions Donald Trump takes, the essential through line is he is gathering to himself more power and taking it from whatever other institution held it before. So, since I'm in Somerville College at the University of Oxford, his war on the universities. Why is he doing it? He's doing it because the universities represent a check, a balance, a restraint on an American president, partly just by research that may be uncongenial to the administration, actual facts that may be unhelpful. So a university is a center of challenge to a president who wants to gather power to himself. So he is at war with them. He is at war with my industry, the media. You can see that in just these apparently petty gestures in which he has shut out the mainstream media from reporting on him. The Associated Press, hardly a left-wing polemical news agency, is no longer in the Oval Office because they refuse to rename the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. They're not there, and instead various sycophants from various partisan, they're not really news organizations, they're propaganda organizations. They are in the White House Oval Office, in the White House press corps instead. Even the war on government agencies, so-called DOGE, this Department of Government Efficiency of Elon Musk, it's billed as cost saving. I don't think that's what it's about. I think that's partly what it's about. But I think its main agenda, under this bogus, base-pleasing pretext of a war on woke and attacking DEI, what it's really about is some of those government agencies were, again, independent centers of power. It's a confusing thing about the United States and how it works, but these agencies are part of the executive branch, but they're not really, or they weren't really under the president. They had independent authority, and he has just absolutely gone to war against all of those. And then just another example, which again, I think was sort of written up perhaps the wrong way, which is his attack on the law firms who had had the temerity in the past to represent people who had opposed him. And he has extorted, there's no other word for it, out of those firms, tens of millions each, now adds up to apparently about $1 billion of promised pro bono legal services. So he's issued executive orders naming specific law firms, saying they will be barred from doing any work with the federal government, which means effectively you're out of action, unless they do a deal and one after another they agree to give him $40 million, $50 million worth of pro bono legal advice. So he now has a legal war chest of $1 billion should he want to challenge or go, if anyone tries to sue him or go to court. That's just sitting there. So that's the picture inside the US, changing everything. A country that was bound by laws, not men, as they famously said. I think it's now a live and maybe even less live question whether rule of law even operates there. How does this then affect the everywhere? This is the everything going on in America, but how does it affect everywhere? It clearly is affecting the rest of the world, the Trump administration, not necessarily in ways he always intended, although there's a caveat to that. Already we have at least 2 election results which are in which Donald Trump can be clearly pronounced the loser. One in Canada, the next I think in Australia, in which the candidate or party that branded itself as anti-Trump got a anti-Trump bounce as a result. The Liberals, you all know, were dead in the water in Canada. Labour were struggling in Australia, and both emerged as winners. Side point, the narcissism of Donald Trump is so great that he actually boasts about having swung the Canadian election. There's an interview with The Atlantic where he said, and I had to go back to the source because I thought surely he didn't say it, in which he said, about the Canadian election, I was disliked so much that the guy who was 25 points ahead ended up losing. That's all because of me. And he thought it was something to be proud of. In other words, attention and being important is the most important thing to him. Those are the most immediate manifestations of how Trump matters. But the obvious underlying causes for those changes, and I won't sort of linger on them too long because you'll be so familiar with them, but one is an attack on the economic world order, and another is an attack on the world order. And let's just briefly say on the economics that tariffs is, his tariff policy is to, again, take a axe to a model of free trade that has held for at least 80 years, actually in many ways more, and which, and this is the curious thing, has obviously brought prosperity to the most of the world, but it has also benefited the United States above all. Far and away the biggest beneficiary of the global trade system has been the United States. Donald Trump, for reasons we could analyze, and the Trump movement needs to always cast itself as victims who have been screwed over. And that's what he says now about the world trade system. Nothing could be further from the truth. The United States has massively benefited. I will only give one figure to illustrate this, but 25% of world GDP goes to the United States. 1 in every $4 of wealth there is in the whole world goes to this one country, which does not represent a quarter of the world's population by any means. Now, you can analyze why he's doing that. There is a kind of nostalgia factor, this notion of bringing back manufacturing jobs, which it has to, be pointed out to him, those manufacturing jobs, which, yes, it is quite true, they did go from North Carolina to Mexico or to China. But those jobs are never coming back because those jobs have gone because of technology. To imagine the world that I think inhabits Donald Trump's head, which is the America of the 1950s, to imagine that world coming back, you do have to be unaware of the way the world has changed in the last 60 or 70 years. Just today, I was with an American who had himself been with Donald Trump in the last 2 weeks. And he offered a very interesting take on Trump, which I hadn't sort of formulated quite as clearly, which is, he said, the thing you've got to understand about Trump is he is both a genius and a moron at the same time. And so genius in the sense of his political ability to dominate and manipulate the news agenda and so on. But he's a moron in the sense of stupid about things that, you can't really believe someone could be that stupid. And I think on the point about tariffs, he genuinely doesn't understand how they work. He always talks as if China will pay this tariff. If a BMW comes into Texas, he thinks Germany pays the tariff. It doesn't matter how many times people explain to him, no, the customer in Texas pays the extra duty. An American person has to write out a check. You can try and make it out, he doesn't get it. And, you can try breaking your head to explain that, but I think my friend with his formulation maybe has done it better. He knows no history. He doesn't know that the Smoot-Hawley Act deepened the American Depression in its attempt to protect American industry. If he has a worldview in his head, it's either the 1950s or the 1800s. It's a different economy. He doesn't seem aware of a global supply chain in which a car made in North America crosses the frontier between Canada and the United States 4 or 5 times. He doesn't seem aware, for example, of non-tangible goods that you cannot touch. In fact, when he launched his war this week on movies and his proposed tariff on films, there were many people who were panicked, not just because they thought that's really bad for the world film industry, but who thought, oh no, this means he's discovered services. He's discovered that services exist. Nobody had ever, no one wanted to whisper the word just in case he started trying to tariff that. And so there is a worry there. The result is warnings from the big retailers in the United States about empty shelves, warnings of a global downturn, already wiping off huge amounts of value in the world's stock markets. He is now boasting about the recovery the stock markets had. That there was a uptick last week or so, Yeah, it came about because of an interview he did with Time magazine, in which he said there are 200 deals that we've already done. We're just waiting to announce them. And the markets got very excited by that. Just yesterday, he said, no, there are no deals. There are no deals done. And so this is what you have to keep up with. My point before about power, by the way, is relevant here too. One of the attractions of tariffs to him is the power of exemption. He loves the idea that individual American businesses will have to go to him as if to an ancient emperor and ask for, as supplicants, for some kind of protection. And sort of Nero style, he will give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And he loves that countries will have to do that too. And he did say to a Republican gathering, have you seen all these countries coming up to kiss my rear end? He didn't use that word. I'm in Somerville College, I'm going to behave myself. He didn't use that word. He said, and he loves the idea that this makes him the central sort of imperial figure. The effect, though, has been to upend a world economic order that, as I say, has held for decades, and on which depends, to a large extent, the prosperity of the rest of the trading world. So this is a huge thing that affects everywhere. This is not now an American issue, this is an us issue. That alone would be huge. If just that had happened, that would be dominating the front pages and the news discussion, policy making, if that was just on its own. But it runs in parallel with him similarly upending the world order. The moment that I think will be remembered and is fresh in everyone's mind still is that encounter between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump in the Oval Office, the humiliation of the Ukrainian president. But there are others which I think are as telling, and I will just offer two. One would be Steve Witkoff, the real estate entrepreneur turned envoy for everything, it seems, emerging from one of many encounters he'd had with Vladimir Putin, parroting Putin's talking points on the war. I mean, if give the man a Russian accent, it would be indistinguishable from Putin's spokesman. He said, they had referendums and they chose. Those areas are really Russian anyway. They wanted to be. I mean, it was as if he had just swallowed the sort of Russia Today playbook. And the third example, and they all came actually in quite similar time, was J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. He really couldn't have made it any clearer what the project was. What then is going on here? Look, part of it is cultural contempt for Europe. You could, and there's interesting work here, there's something going on in this particular form of nationalist conservatism that has decided that, and it's very bound up with gender, I think, that America, as was, represented sort of maleness and machismo, and Europe is somehow feminized and weaker, softer. That is partly where the common ground is, incidentally, with Orban, Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin. That's why the stuff around sexuality, it's all of a piece of an underlying notion of Europe having sort of decayed, weakened, feminized, and the notion of masculinity, very, very important in the wider Trump project. Not so much actually in him, but definitely in Vance and the others around him. That's part of it. The second is a resentment of any restraint on power. So just as they're after the universities or the media, they look at Europe and NATO actually as something which is just a thorn in their side, that gets in the way, that tells them no. And Trump doesn't want that. But the third reason, and this is in a way the most troubling, is an opposition to, an antagonism to, the core principle, I would argue, that is embodied by, in some ways was central to the founding of the European Union. And that is, just to put it extremely simply, the principle against the crime of aggression. The principle that large, powerful states should not be able to attack and gobble up small states. I mean, I'm deliberately putting it in almost childish language because it's so simple. And that principle, which has underpinned international law, alliances, and so on, for, again, 80 years, since the end of the war, whose ending we are marking and celebrating the 80th anniversary of VE Day this very week, more or less imperfectly, of course, on and often in the breach. But the principle has been that we are moving away from a world in which big states can just eye up smaller states that they want and take them. And yet, this is the world he wants. And so people so very quickly thought he was joking when he said, we've got our eye on the Panama Canal, we've got our eye on Greenland, Canada should be the 51st state, Gaza should be a beach resort. I mean, a macabre thing to say. And yet this is the world he wants, in which might is right, that the strongest powers can take what they want without any sanction. Because of course, the United States benefits from that kind of world. And it has always known it could, because it is the biggest and has the, or most powerful, and has the most powerful military. Of course it could. He wants a world in which, you know, the strong can grab what they want, they let you do it. If any of you recognize the wording that Donald Trump used in a very different context a few years ago. So the obstacle in the way of that world is the European Union. It stands absolutely against that vision of the world. And that manifests itself in multiple ways. The first thing, it is a key, in some ways, soul body for a restraint of power on the global stage, particularly in the economic sphere. So you think, for example, of the taming of the tech giants. There was recently a £700 million fine on Apple and Meta that came from the European Union. I think it was, in their terms, really a slap of the wrists. They could have done much more. But there is that power that Europe does have, the European Union has, on those big tech giants who are emerging as the kind of oligarchy behind Trump. Just as Putin has his oil and gas oligarchs, the tech giants are emerging as the sort of tech bro equivalent of that for Donald Trump. The EU stands in their way, whether it's AI or monopolistic practices. The EU stands there. It's one of the few bodies able to restrain. But almost more important than that is that the European Union embodies the very ethos that opposes the principle of might versus right. It stands against the crime of aggression. That was almost why it was founded. And so this is the world that is emerging, that on the one side, the might is right principle, protectionism and so on, of domination and international law, certainly, but even the law can go hang. That's one side. And then on the other, law, centrally, cooperation, non-aggression, free trade, embodied, I would argue, in our world now by the European Union, not only by the European Union, but centrally by the European Union. We finally have then this split between Mars and Venus that was analyzed, you know, Americans from Mars, Europeans from Venus, Robert Kagan's idea 20 plus years ago. I think it is beginning to form in our before our eyes in a more concrete way than before. And by the way, the boundaries are not hard and fast. So I would say also in that might is right world is Vladimir Putin and Russia. I think China is open to a world like that because it too could benefit. And there are countries who are against it, who are obviously not in that place. Canada and Australia, just two examples. So it's not just America v. Europe, but there are a sort of an American approach to the world and an European approach to the world, and that is how the world is divided. What we have witnessed in just 108 days or so is the United States swapping sides in that battle. That meeting, the Oval Office meeting, the Zelensky dance in Munich, that's what was really happening. The United States was saying, we're no longer part of the world of cooperation and alliances and law. We're in the world of the law of the jungle and power and might. And that is a huge change since 1945. Enter Britain. Britain has to see that change that is coming. For so long, it has tried to delay, postpone, fudge that choice, as it were, and to say we don't have to make a choice. On the contrary, we will be the bridge between these two worlds. They are not at odds. And, you know, smart Alex would say, well, the trouble with being a bridge is you end up with people walking all over you. But in a way, the people who made that case had a point, because, you know, you looked at Barack Obama's America, and it did seem wrong to regard that as a different planet from Europe. But that is not the case now. Now it is, there's that clear distinction. Some will say, hold on, don't overread, don't have recency bias, don't overread the picture now. Trump will pass, they'll say. To which I respond, that position may just have been tenable in 2016, although I would say not, but you know, we'll grant that. In 2016, 2017, maybe you could argue it was one-off, it was an aberration. The man has been re-elected, despite everything that happened, including an attempt to overturn an election. This, I think, unfortunately shows you, and as a huge admirer of America, it grieves me to say this, but this is not a passing phenomenon. This has deep roots. The fact of his re-election, the fact that in polls now, they're the lowest for any president at this stage, but still 39%, 40% have seen everything we've seen and still think that's okay. This is this has deep roots, and I think it's fair to say that Trumpism, in some form, is not just a passing phenomenon. I mean, I don't think they're going to get somebody who has the same kind of dark charisma that he has, but I think the idea that this is a passing aberration, I think, is fantasy. And I think even if it were, at the very least, just to make the claim at its most modest, surely the lesson we have to take from this decade of Trump is that you cannot rely on America being the United States, being a fixed point on, as it were, our side of that divide, you know, the democratic world versus the authoritarian world. It is not anymore a given the United States is in that camp. Let's just put it no more strongly than that. Some will say, oh, well, look, you know, we see that this is a bad thing that's going on, but Europe is not much better. Europe has its problems too. Orban, we've got this very troubling election result in Romania, Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany, all of which is true. But to me, that just underlines that there is a struggle going on in the world between nationalist populism, authoritarianism, and liberal democratic values. It doesn't fit absolutely neatly. Like I said, Canada and Australia, they're not in the EU, but they're on one side of it. And Hungary and Romania are in the EU, and maybe they are edging to the other side of that. That just tells you this struggle is going on. And right now, the United States is on the wrong side of that battle. You know, there was Elon Musk intervening in the German election on the side of the AfD. You have JD Vance doing the same. They have picked a side, and we delude ourselves if we hope and pretend they haven't. They have. What then to do? I think, you know, I'm not going to, in this talk, and certainly before this audience, come up with, you know, very specific, concrete measures that I think are, but rather a thrust. I think the idea of chasing, with some degree of desperation, a bilateral deal for Britain alone is a mistaken strategy. And if you want to see the evidence, I would look at the universities in the United States. That's what Columbia University tried to do. Trump comes after them. There's, you know, we're going to withhold $400 million in funding unless you let us basically run your various departments. And they said, okay. And they started doing the deal. And what did he do? He came back for more, because of course he did. They'd shown weakness. Harvard stood up to Trump, and suddenly they began to wobble and said, oh, that letter we sent was a mistake, and so on. After that, the universities are beginning to come together. It's exactly what the law firms should have done. Instead, they all made their single one-on-one deals. When I see Keir Starmer and his invitation to a royal visit, I think he's doing the Columbia thing rather than the Harvard thing. And I think you've got to do that working together, and strength in numbers. And the obvious institution that, again, embodies that in the non-American democratic West is the European Union. 27 countries together obviously is already that strength in numbers. So I think that's a crucial lesson. It's anyway what we should be doing, because if there is a global trade war going on, all the more reason why you do not want to have put up barriers to trade with your nearest neighbors. Anybody who was against Brexit was trying to say that before anyway, and it was true then. How much more true is it now? Doubly true when you are into a world of tariffs. If there is a great big free trade area there where there isn't going to be a threat of tariffs, obviously it's good to be trading with them rather than chasing after some 10% or softened blow there. The cooperation on defense, in a way, you don't need me to make that case. J.D. Vance made that case in Munich, and Donald Trump made that case when he humiliated Volodymyr Zelensky. We cannot rely on an American umbrella to protect us when they are part of the threat, when they have sided with the threat. They are with Vladimir Putin. It's a grievous thought to think that. Again, for anyone who was an Atlanticist and still would like to be one, that's a hard thought to take in. That cooperation has to be in the form of the kind of security cooperation that I think Brits are already comfortable with, but it has to go further. And it's crazy, it seems to me, for us not to be part of this spending pot, this 150 billion. This is urgent stuff. There is as Ronald Reagan said, there is a bear in the woods in the form of Vladimir Putin, who threatens Europe, and our big friend and ally is no longer with us. So this seems to me urgent. We will have allies who are not EU states, Canada, Australia, and who have, as it were, European values in the Mars-Venus sense. I think we should work with them too. But we are nearer to the European Union. The sort of Canada-Australia option doesn't make as much sense for us as it might make for them. But I'll take it at the moment if that's what's on the table. A democratic West without the US, I think, is something we need to think about. And I think also it means making a political case to the British people and to be bold about that. If there is one positive lesson we can learn from Donald Trump, it is that being big and being really radical gets things done. I mean, he's doing it in the most negative way possible, but it is possible, he shows, to make big political moves, especially once you are in office. And a Labour government with a big majority really could be making a massive case for Europe. And Donald Trump has done the hard work for you, is what I would say. He's explained to the British people why. Obviously, our natural allies are those who are closest to us. You couldn't ask for, in a way, a more eloquent advocate for the case of European cooperation than Donald J. Trump. The public get this. Two reasons I say that. The first, the numbers, again, underreported, healthy, solid, consistent majorities are not only for closer cooperation, 64% in the last YouGov poll favor closer relations, including 60% of Leave voters, by the way. But 55% favor rejoining the EU, with 39% saying they strongly support rejoining the EU. I think if there was the political leadership for it, this is becoming a sort of it's a mainstream position. And by the way, that survey was done in January, before these 100 days, before the shakedown of Volodymyr Zelensky. I mean, the numbers now will be higher. So I think we can do that. And I said there were two reasons. The first, why you can be confident. The first is the polling, but the second one is something that I think is should be a cause for great pride in Britain, which is that sentiment, that pro-Putin, anti-Ukraine sentiment, which has echoes obviously in this Romanian election, but big in the United States. There is no analog for that here. It's a problem for Nigel Farage and Reform that they have, and he has those sort of Putin adjacent positions. He has to tiptoe around that. That tells you something, that the whole premise of this wide divide that I've been trying to sketch today is understood by the British public, to the point where even the anti-Europeans know that they don't want to be on the wrong side of that divide. That if they're lining up with Team Putin and Trump, that's bad for them. electorally and politically. So those things I think can give us confidence. I would say, to go back to those words of Julian Priestley, who foresaw in either 2016 or 2017, a cold climate of populism and authoritarianism. That is now the world that he foresaw. We are now in that world. One that sees lawless authoritarianism as embodied by Donald Trump versus shared power and cooperation in the form of the European ideal. We have to know which side of that we're on. Donald Trump says, it's my closing thought, Donald Trump says the European Union was founded solely to damage the United States. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't expect historical accuracy from him. But obviously that's wrong. And it's tellingly wrong, because what it was truly founded for, its true founding purpose is beyond him. He doesn't understand it. Its true founding purpose was for an ideal of a world in which nations who had fought each other instead worked together, for nations that had shed infinite volumes of blood would instead make a future of peace, a future where might wouldn't be right, where instead there was law and where small nations could be protected from bigger nations. That was the ideal it was founded for. That is what is now under threat. And that is why I say Donald Trump makes it essential that our country rethinks its relationship with Europe. Thank you very much.
So Jonathan has very kindly agreed to answer some questions. Jonathan, we've got 20 minutes, I do believe, before you have to run out of the door. So questions. I'm especially looking for young people, it has to be said. I'm terribly sorry, sir. I can see that. Okay, there's a young person there. Oh, I've got to run to you with the microphone.
I can see two young people at least.
It's good for my steps.
Just simply from just trying to understand a bit more what you're saying. Oh, better? Okay.
Yeah.
Are you saying that the United States might lose its democracy? Because you're saying that Trump siding to more authoritarian, more to that side. So is then in the future as a whole, then the United States democracy is being threatened? Is that what you're sort of insinuating? Okay.
Yeah, yes, unfortunately, it's a terrifying thought, but I think democratic backsliding, which, by the way, is a phenomenon that is measured. I mean, scholars work on that around all kinds of places in the world where there are key signs, and there's indications of it. One of the key indicators, for example, is attacking of free media, and I didn't get onto the lawsuits Donald Trump is mounting at CBS and ABC, but one of the main ones is attacking judges. And one of the preeminent scholars of democratic backsliding, and the name escapes me, and forgive me, but has charted that the rate of backsliding is faster in the United States than in any place he's measured before, faster than Orban's Hungary, Poland under the PIS, and faster than Erdogan's Turkey. If you think about how long it took for those places to get to where they've got, it was measured in years. In 3 months, he has done more democratic backsliding. So I think it has to be a real concern. You look at the Supreme Court with its blanket immunity ruling for the president. I think it's a genuine question. And I speak to Americans a lot, and they themselves formulate the question in the same way. So I'm not saying it's going to happen. I really hope the country fights back and saves its own democracy. But that's where we're at, I think. That's the challenge.
Mike, you're the man with the mic, so you can just hand it back.
I think it was already handed. I'll hand it over again. I found it particularly interesting how you drew attention to a leadership problem that exists not only among universities in the US or among law firms in the US, but also internationally, where the UK, although it may be the best option for it, does not approach the EU proactively, nor does the EU approach other like-minded nations. How do we solve this leadership problem? Who can stand up and form this coalition that makes us stronger in numbers?
It's such a good question, and it is the question that people, I think, are really wrestling with, because it's in some ways the one intangible that you cannot just magic out of strategy meetings. I would say just one thing, which is sometimes people emerge from the most unlikely quarters. If you had said to me 3 months ago, a technocrat central banker with a very sort of cerebral, even slightly dour manner, would emerge as the main and valiant antagonist to Donald Trump, I would never have believed you. And yet there's Mark Carney giving us a sort of tutorial in how it's done. So I think people do emerge. But I do think partly politics is such a dynamic process that it is partly about creating space. So the people in this room, I always think if we were as loud as the anti-Europeans, that would create some room and space for, it may not be Keir Starmer, but it could be somebody in his cabinet who's suddenly starts running with this. The business of being outriders, by the way, outriders make life easier for leaders. I mean, Jan's a former cabinet minister, she knows about this. They sometimes need you to urge them to drag them further. The right were brilliant at this. They would say, let's leave let's have an in-out referendum, when what they actually wanted was a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. Say, by demand a lot, you'll get something. But we often are cautious, and we often sort of say exactly what would be the ultimate ideal, rationally. Whereas in some ways, aim big and ask big. And that's why I've formulated it today in quite sort of large primary color terms, I hope, because I think it's partly a lesson from them. And I think we should be making the case for rejoin. So there's space to just go into the customs union or the single market. Instead, I think often pro-Europeans say, well, let's just go for the customs union because that's something that's realistic. Well, if you ask for that, you won't get anything. So ask for the bigger thing, and then maybe we'll get something. Thank you.
We've got a couple of questions online.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll go through a couple of those. Claire is asking, do you believe there's any opportunity to sideline the USA and to have countries stop giving Trump the focus he craves?
Well, they're good questions, and they're different. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to sideline the country that is the most powerful economically and militarily. But building up our alternatives to it is an urgent task. And that's why we're not going to magic away a world in which the United States' military dominance exists. But what you can do is build up the European strength. And that's why I mentioned that 150 billion fund. By the way, Merz is a good example of leadership. I think it was within hours of that election when he said incredibly stark terms, almost actually the way I've been putting it, there's now a choice and we have to defend ourselves. He put it very boldly, and I think it's just having the confidence to just say what something is and give it its name. There are people willing to do that. So I think we can't hope to sideline. What we can hope to do is build up an alternative. In terms of giving the attention he craves, I remember trying that one in sort of 2017 or 2018. Let's not even talk about it. It doesn't work. Instead, I think we have to do a sort of judo move, and let's use all this attention that's on him for our benefit. So he does dominate the world news agenda. There's no getting around it. He's a genius at that. I think that's the other half of the divide my friend this morning mentioned. But let's do that judo move where we use his appalling statements and behavior to galvanize people on the other side. So you make him the face of not being in the European Union, if you see what I mean. This is the world now. We're either with them or we're with him. He's the guy who won't, pay for a pump to help newborn babies live. You want to be with that guy? That's the Nigel Farage route. So use the attention. It's got people focusing on politics and on the world in a way that they weren't before. A lot of these arguments that we used to make, it was hard to get a hearing for them in 2015, 2016. Now I think people's ears are open, not necessarily for reasons we'd have chosen, but they're there.
We've got a couple more questions from people online, then let's go back to the people in the room.
Yeah.
Jane is asking, Why do you think the Labour Party is refusing to be bold and honest about the need to get closer to the EU, perhaps rejoining in the future, starting with a single market or a customs union?
It is similar. I mean, I think it's partly just fear, isn't it, from experience, which I do understand. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear Jan on this, but you know those losses, the referendum itself, and particularly 2019, losing the so-called red wall, losing Labour seats, has led to a sort of sense that Brexit is kryptonite to Labour. You just mustn't even look at it and talk about it because it just destroys the Labour coalition. I think you have to think again. I just don't believe that if the case is made properly, you're going to find people in those seats as attached to this project, which has failed them. Let's be clear. The people who voted Brexit because they thought it was going to bring back jobs and reduce immigration, you know, how's that working out for you? It didn't work for them. And I think you can make a case that says, look, the world is not the one it was in 2016. And there is a different moment. But I think you have to do it with tremendous confidence. But where I'm heartened is that it's those very people, by the way, those voters, a lot of them, who are appalled by Trump's position on Ukraine, for example, and you feel that is very un-British. It's not what Churchill would have done. It's just an appalling stance. So I think there's a way to make that argument. I just don't believe when you're looking at polls saying 64% think we should have closer relationship with Europe, the idea of going into some of those seats and saying we're going to do that, and we're only doing it because we've seen the alternative and it's been a huge 4% contraction in the country's GDP. I think you'll get a hearing for that in a way you perhaps, I'll grant, would have found it much harder in 2019.
One more question from online, then let's go back to the room. There's a question specifically about your views on Trump and Trumpism. She says, as a vocal and open critic of Trump and Trumpism, do you feel safe in the US now?
Well, it's a good question. I actually have not been since he was sworn in January. And what is it? It's now May. So I haven't tested this. But I am due to travel there twice this year, maybe even 3 times. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, I had exactly that advice this morning. Take a burner phone. I may have to do that. Yeah.
Cool. The microphone for the audience is being passed around now.
Can you choose some people? There's a lot of people around here.
Terrible ageism at work here.
Just give somebody up at front.
Young in spirit.
That's right.
Young in spirit. And lots of men too.
Thanks. As one of the oldies, and just to reinforce it, I want to just start by mentioning Julian Priestley, because when he was at Baylor and I was at University College London, we were both vying to be president of what's now the Young European Movement, and it happened we tied the votes, so we split the term between us, very democratic. But no, Julian was a great friend. The question I've got, climate change, you didn't mention that because one of the things Trump has done is pull out Paris, and but one thing that is perhaps more positive, I don't disagree with the overall thesis of what a disaster Trump is, but after Trump announced his decision to pull out of Paris again, 350 US mayors and I think 20 odd governors, state governors, signed a declaration saying they will continue with the Paris net zero targets. And of course, they can do that under the federal system. And of course, some of the big mayors have substantial powers. Do you think there's any hope that the federal system and the role of the big mayors and state governors can counteract some of Trump's policies?
Yes, and you're absolutely right to mention climate, and it's such an huge area in which his backsliding, put it very mildly, affects the whole world. I mean, he's really actively embracing fossil fuels. He's not just not in favor of action against the climate crisis. He's actively an enthusiast for fossil fuels, which is again one of those things that is quite hard to get your head around. Look, that is an important center, and it definitely was in the first Trump term. And you did see those initiatives. It is, I'm afraid, one of the things that this second Trump administration is wise to. And I think this is one of the things that will be fascinating tested by the courts, in the courts, because they are attempting, it's another rival center of power. Now, the Republicans and the right in the United States have always been for states' rights. You know, that even when that phrase meant something very different in terms of segregation and slavery. It is the premise of his policy on abortion, incidentally. It's why he was partly able to diffuse that issue in the 2024 election by saying, look, it's up to your state. There have been already 1 or 2 examples in which they say they have challenged the authority of states, and I think even specifically on climate. You know, he's going after these EV mandates on electric cars, in which, you know, California and others say, well, that's our prerogative to do that, and he is issuing executive orders and other things to challenge that. I think it will be a massive indicator of whether the Supreme Court is a genuine court or whether they are enthralled to the, you know, to the Trump movement, is what judgment they make on that. Do they find a way to bend it so that we're for the states having power when it's a right-wing issue, and we're against the states having power when it's against Trump? I think it's at least a question, and we don't know how this court will land. Their judgments have been very different, but I think it's a very, very good question. I just wouldn't take it as read they have the powers to challenge a president that they did 6 years ago or 8 years ago, I'm afraid.
There's a gentleman there, and then I just need some women as well, please.
There we are.
All of the questions online so far have been from women. So, yeah.
There's a question
That's
over
really-
there, I can see.
So can I say a super talk? Thank you. And
Thank
I
you.
think you've made a very good case for us all to become Carneyites, I say as a fellow Irishman.
Yeah.
But my question really was about the next election or elections, should they ever happen in the States. And I know we're feeling glum enough already, but the Democrats are very hopeful of taking the House, probably not the Senate in 2 years' time. But I wonder whether they're being over-optimistic, because what's working against them is, first of all, the media already, the big money, the fact that the electoral system is at Trump's mercy has already, I think, taken over the mechanism of doing that, and there won't be any more Raffenspergers, we don't think. And finally, the electorate are going to be frightened by the cost of undoing Trump's damage and getting back into net zero, etc. So unfortunately, my feeling is that they will need to work very, very hard to achieve in 2026 and even more so in 2028. I don't know if you can reassure us on any of those things.
No, I think, I mean, because I have been a bit gloomy. So I'm going to be a little bit reassuring on the midterm elections. I think they will. I mean, most people do, most analysts, but they often got things wrong before. The margin is, the majority of the Republicans have is so small. It really is razor thin that I think it will not take much, even with the kind of headwinds you're talking about, for Democrats to retake the House. And that will be the beginning, I hope, very much hope, of a fight back, because you suddenly get some powers. They have no power at all at the moment, Democrats. They don't hold any institutions. I think we're used to, in a parliamentary system, imagine there must be some things they can do. They're really, you know, I remember speaking to one Democrat and he said, well, you know, we can hold press conferences. And he was sort of saying it as if, that's not bad, is it? You know, and I thought, wow, that's what we're in for. So I think they have nothing then. They will suddenly get committees and hearings and all that. So I think it will go that way, partly because Democrats do tend to do well in these off-year elections. Their turnout is better. Off-year is wrong, midterm elections. The other factor is that and this is what I think that's dividing Democratic strategists, which is at the moment they're not saying anything and they're not doing anything, and supporters and people who are worried about democracy tearing their hair out, saying, you know, you've got to be on the battlefield. Why aren't you saying? In a strange way, that that sheer blankness is working to their advantage, because all the feelings that people are building up of opposition to Trump will just naturally go there without any, there's no sort of friction there. So the lack of identity, which I think would be a big problem in 2028, the midterm elections may be okay. They just become the none of the above, or the sort of not this party. And that may be okay. So I'm hopeful about that, but I think you're right to alert us to those headwinds. They are definitely there.
One more question. There's two rows in the back. Oh my God.
We probably could do 2 or 3 more. If I finish at 6:40, I'll be all right. Okay.
Sorry, I just
I'm
wanted
not
to
risking
ask.
that in my game.
I just wanted to ask if there's anyone you're saying the Democrats are quite a blank slate at the moment, but is there anyone emerging that you think, or people on the fringes who might come and lead? Like the only one I'm really noticing is, apart from AOC and Bernie Sanders, who are doing their own roadshow, but is it JB Pritzker,
JB Pritzker,
who
yeah.
I just think is utterly American, and I'm speaking as a Brit. And I don't know whether you rate him, or because he just seems very powerful speaker, very not afraid to have strong opinions. He looks like he could fight Donald and win, you know, physically.
Yes.
What do you think?
Did you say physically?
Yeah.
Yes.
If he
No,
could do a
I-
contest, he'd beat him.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good observation. And I'll just share this one with you. That I once interviewed Mario Cuomo's speechwriter, who said, and it's that thing, he said, there is a subtext of male violence in American presidential politics, and voters need to believe that this person will be able to take that person. And Biden's frailty, physical frailty, was definitely a factor. So I don't dismiss that. And Pritzker is, a big guy, and if you see pictures of him, he's a big guy. What helps him is his money. And he sometimes says to audiences, "I'm a real billionaire," and that gets under Trump's skin a bit. You can imagine. I think it's just too early to tell. I mean, you just never know at this stage. Cory Booker did this amazing 25-hour speech. I think the interesting thing is the old playbooks that said you have to look this way or talk that way or be that way, I don't think operate anymore. Trump has shown you that if you have this kind of confidence and this kind of swagger, you can do things even if you don't fit the usual image. That said, I think it's easier to do that and to be irreverent and taboo breaking, frankly, as a white man. He could do some of that stuff. And there's the bar is just so much higher for Democrats anyway, and I think particularly for women. I think that was a big part of the election. So I don't know how that plays out, but they've got quite a sort of deep bench. They do have quite a lot of talent, but I think it's far too early to tell. And I'm slightly hopeful about a sort of Mark Carney syndrome, somebody that we would never have thought of somehow emerges. And also, hopefully, and again, I don't think this is guaranteed, that person hopefully will not be running against Donald Trump. Now, I don't rule out Trump trying to run for a third term, which is obviously against the Constitution, but that's not holding him back in other things. But if presuming it's not Trump, then all kinds of people could emerge.